We've clicked on 8:30, Phil, so if you would like to intro the session, that'd be great.
Surely. So yeah, Father God, we do thank you for Australia, and we just do think of our people who are suffering through bushfires at the moment. We ask for your comfort for them, and for your churches in those areas to rise up and be Jesus' hands in those times. But for tonight, we just ask for your help for Gav as he leads us through this. And Lord, we know it's buying a house is such a big thing, but we know that you love having your people settled in houses or units or wherever it is. And so, Father, we just ask for your wisdom as we listen, and just for your inspiration as we take the knowledge that we learn tonight and use it. So, Father, I just ask for all these people all over Australia just to just also know how good you are through this webinar. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Phil. Really appreciate you being online and praying for us this evening. So my name's Gavin Martin. I'm from Cornerstone Wealth. I'm just facilitating this evening's webinar. That was Phil Watson, the Digital Marketing Coordinator from Christian Super, just introing the session. So we're talking about how to break into the property market or help your kids to this evening. Just an important note that tonight's information is advice of a general nature only. So please seek personal financial advice before making any decision. The key to getting into your first home, so buying your first home, is to save 20% deposit plus your stamp duty. And the reason for having a 20% deposit is a couple of fold. One is that you can avoid the mortgage insurance that your lender will charge you if you don't have a 20% deposit. So 20% means if you're buying a $400,000 property and you need a 20% deposit, that's an $80,000 deposit, and let's say that stamp duty is worth another $20,000. That means you need $100,000 as a good target to get into your first home. Now, some lenders do lend at lower rates than 20% deposit without mortgage insurance, but there are fewer and far between, and you just need to touch base with either a mortgage broker or directly with the lender to work out whether they will provide that if you haven't got the 20% deposit. But it is important and a good approach to take to have that 20% deposit. It also gives you a buffer that if the market does fall and you need to sell the property, that you won't have debt over and above the value of the property as well. You won't be what they call underwater. So it is a good approach to have that sort of deposit if you can. You can take advantage of government grants and stamp duty concessions, and you can also take advantage of the First Home Saver Super Scheme to accelerate the saving of a deposit for your first home. A number of you asked about how to save for your first home, and they are some mechanisms that you can use to boost that. Boost the savings, mainly through tax savings, but we'll talk about that shortly. So save a 20% deposit plus stamp duty is the key. The other thing to factor in when you are buying your first home is to buy an affordable home, which means that the repayments on that home should not be more than 40% of your take-home income. And the key around this is not overcommitting. If you're at the top end of the 40% or 30 to 40% range of the cost of your home in terms of repayments, or that might be rent if you're renting at the moment, is that it means that you're going to be stretched a little bit, and that might be fine for a short time. But you need to factor in things like if your income is going to lower because you're going to start a family and one of you won't be working for a time. But on the flip side of that, you can also factor in if you are at the higher end of the sort of 40% of your take-home pay going towards your mortgage repayments, you might be able to factor in that, well, in a couple of years, the kids will be at school and the second spouse might be able to go back to work, and you might be able to gain a little bit more income. And so then your 40% of take-home pay going towards your housing costs ends up being 35 or 30 once you've that other person has or the other spouse has gained some employment. So don't overcommit. Don't buy a house that is too expensive for your cash flow requirements. I think long term, so ideally purchase of property, there's a high entry cost and a high exit cost. So there's stamp duty cost and there's real estate fees if you are needing to sell. And so the idea is that property is a longer term investment. You don't want to be jumping in and out of property, because even if the value of it has gone up, you're likely to not get as much benefit as if you hold it for a longer term. And you need to make sure that you have a cash reserve should you have time between jobs. So ideally, we say 3 to 6 months living expenses, and often you can hold that in an offset account, which we'll talk about next. One other thing that you need to factor in as well, if you are taking on debt, is to consider your insurances. Now, you can take out insurances with Christian Super, and they include life insurance, so pays a lump sum in the event of your death. So if one spouse died, then you could pay out, it would pay out a lump sum, ideally at least equivalent to the debt, and so that the other spouse, for example, wouldn't need to sell the home. There are other types of insurances, so total and permanent disability insurance. So if you're ill and not able to work, it would pay a lump sum similar to the death cover if you died. And then there's income protection cover if you're ill and not able to work. So that's more of a temporary disability. It will pay up to 75% of your salary. And there's one other type of insurance, trauma, that will pay a lump sum on the event of a health event like having cancer treatment or having a heart attack. So it is good to think about those buffers and those contingencies when you do have a significant amount of debt. And the other thing is to pay off debt as quickly as possible. So ideally, you would pursue principal and interest repayments rather than just interest repayments, so that you're actually creating more equity in your property over time. And I like to differentiate your regular payments rather than having a facility that has got a redraw associated with it. I find that people that aren't that disciplined with their finances and have their income going directly into their mortgage account and then all their spending coming out of that same account, it often means that, and particularly if they're able to redraw very easily in that process, I've sometimes come across people who have had a larger mortgage after 5 years rather than a smaller one, because they've utilised this flexibility and redraw facility and they've not actually progressed and moved forward. So keep your regular payments separately. Don't use a redraw. If you've got surplus savings and your facility allows for it, I suggest using an offset account, which means that you've got the funds available. It reduces your interest expense, but you keep your regular payments towards your mortgage going. So that's the ideal way to purchase a property. In terms of some of the items that can help you save for that deposit, one of the announcements from last year's federal budget, May last year, was the First Home Saver Super Contribution Scheme. And now this was announced but not legislated. It's now legislated, so it is in force. So this is where you can take or make contributions in excess of your standard employer contributions, the 9.5% that your employer puts into super. You can make those additional contributions of up to $15,000 per year or $30,000 maximum during your lifetime. If you put that money into your superannuation, the government will allow you to then withdraw that contribution with some assumed growth to put towards your first home. Now, the benefit of that is particularly if you make those contributions as what we call concessional contributions, because it saves you tax along the way. So and this is a per person limit. So you can put in $15,000 per year per person. So if there's two of you if there's a couple, then you can both take advantage of this and save some tax, and therefore build a higher deposit than if you didn't take advantage of this scheme. So who does it apply to, or what does it apply to? It applies to contributions from the 1st of July 2017. So this is the first financial year in which you can take advantage of it. And to take advantage of it, you need to get the contributions into your super account prior to the 30th of June 2018. And then the earliest at which you can access the money is the 1st of July 2018. So you could actually put in $15,000 of contributions this financial year, and then $15,000 in July, and then you would have available to you, depending on what type of contribution you made, you would have those funds available to you as early as July 2018. There are tax on withdrawals depending on how you put the money in. There's two types of contributions that you can make into the scheme. One is what we call a concessional contribution. That's where if you put in $15,000 into your account as either a salary sacrifice contribution or just a lump sum and then claimed a tax deduction on it, 15% tax would be payable on it, but that's less than potentially your marginal tax rate. So it's important to be, if you're going to take advantage of this scheme, to be earning more than, say, $20,500 for it to be of benefit to you. So what happens is the $15,000 goes in, you might pay tax of 15%. It's less than the tax that you would pay if you were paying tax in at your marginal rates. And then afterwards, you can draw that money out and put it towards your buying your first home. Now, there isn't a convenient estimator that the government made available to us on a budget night last year, so budget.gov.au/estimator. So this is that actual address, so budget.gov.au/estimator. I'll just zoom in so that you can see it a little bit clearer. So you can go to this website yourself and you can check it out for your particular circumstances or your kids' circumstances, depending on what it is. And so it's saying, well, what's my taxable income? And let's say in this instance it's $70,000. And how much are we going to put into super? So in this instance, we're going to say we're going to forego, let's say $15,000 of which is the maximum amount on an annual basis. We're going to put $15,000 of our salary, rather than taking it into our bank account. We're going to get our employer to direct it straight into our super. And the benefit after 2 years is that we'd have $25,355 available to go and then buy your first home. So that's $5,800 more than if you had just saved it in a standard term deposit. And so that's the benefit of it. So rather than having, say, just under $20,000, you've got over $25,000 to use as a deposit. Now, it is a bit of a complex structure in the way that it's set up, but if you are in this phase of purchasing a home and you don't think you'll purchase it until after the 1st of July 2018, then it's well worthwhile considering. And you can do it for both members of a couple can take advantage of it. So you can go to this website and try it yourself. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of first home owner grants, but they are different for each state. So each state and territory has their own arrangements. The grants are a federal scheme, but they're administered at a state level. So this is a really good site, firsthome.gov.au. And it will bring up this screen, and then you can select the particular state that you're in, and that will direct you to the relevant information for your state. For example, in Victoria, there's currently a $10,000 first homeowner grant and $20,000 grant for if you're either building a new home in a regional area. So check out the details of your particular state or territory to see what is available for you. Now, if you can't afford to buy your own home to live in, there are a few alternatives to consider. The first one is to rent long term and to build up other assets. So if you can't afford to buy into your own home, and that's particularly a problem in Melbourne and Sydney because of the acceleration of house prices. And I think one person asked, well, where's the best place to buy in Sydney for less than $600,000? I don't have that sort of advice for you. It's really just around the strategies that you can apply to get into the property market rather than specific area-based advice. So if you can't afford to buy a home to live in, then renting long term is a reasonable option. But you don't just want to rent long term and not have another solution for building your assets. So if you are looking at renting long term, I would encourage you to focus on either building up your superannuation assets. You might be focusing on building a business that can be either sold or generate some good income from at a later point. You might focus on shares or property that you invest in rather than living in. Amberin asks, rents and cost of living in Sydney is too high, would like some strategies. Yeah, great. So this is what we're trying to think through here with some of the strategies, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, but it can apply to other locations as well. So if you're renting long term, really try and focus on doing as much as you can on those other assets. Another way to do it is to buy in a cheaper location or a lower cost property. So if you can't afford a property in Sydney, then you might be able to move further out and afford to buy there. The challenge with that sort of scenario is that you need to factor in the travel costs. So if you're having to drive, for example, an hour and a half to get to your work location, then you really need to factor that into the equation. Is it worth buying just to get into the market and live in that home? And is that a long-term proposition? Could you do it for a long term? It's good to buy a home, good to get into the market, but is a long-term proposition to be able to do that? Will you have enough time to do everything else you need to do in life? Are there schools appropriate for you in the area, and what are the amenities like if you are moving out to those more remote type areas? So you need to factor in those things if you go looking at just moving to another location. Are there job opportunities? I know property's often cheaper in some locations, but there's not the same employment opportunities. So factor in all those as you're considering moving to a cheaper location to gain access to property. Another option is to rentvest. Now, rentvest is a bit of a term that's come up in recent years to describe the situation where you are renting a property or living elsewhere, not living in the property that you own, but you own an investment property. The idea here is that you're able to take advantage of the interest repayments on that property that you own and are renting out, are tax deductible. Now, if you're paying out more than you're getting in rent, in expenses, then it's what we call negative gearing, and you can reduce your taxable income on that basis. Now, if you're negative gearing, you really want to make sure that the value of the property is going up, because there's no point paying out more than you get from an investment over time. So it is important to make sure that you are in a growth location and you're not just losing money by negative gearing. The other thing to factor in is that Labor has a policy that they're going to remove negative gearing. So if they do get into government in the next year or so, then you may need to factor that in. It is, I think their policy is to only do it for new properties, so they'll leave negative gearing for existing properties, but it is something to factor in if you are considering this rent vesting approach. The beauty about rent vesting is there is some flexibility to it. So if you need to move because of work, you can just go and rent another property elsewhere to live in whilst you've got tenants in your investment property. So it provides the flexibility. It also provides you the flexibility to live potentially in an area where the property prices are high but the relative rental cost is low. So it can work in that respect. It is beneficial if you can live in the property that you purchase for a time. The reason for that is that it can, if you live in it, so if you buy it and move into it straight away, then it can be considered your primary place of residence, and then the asset becomes a capital gains tax-free asset. And if you then move out of it, so you've lived in it for a time, and then you move out of it, and you can rent it out for 6 years, and it still is a capital gains tax-free asset. So it is beneficial if you can work it out to live in that property first and then move out. You can only have one primary place of residence, so you can't do it for multiple properties, but for that first property that you purchase, it is a really good way to grow your wealth and not have to incur the capital gains tax if you do sell it in the future. So that's the concept of rent vesting. You do have to make sure the cash flow adds up though. Dan asks, how long do you have to live in a property before you can rent vest? You can rent vest at any point in time. What I was talking about there with rent vesting is that it is great if you can satisfy the requirements for it being your primary place of residence, so you can grow the asset tax-free. If you don't live in it, you just buy it and get tenants in straight away. It'll be an asset that will grow. That if it does grow in value, it will capital gains tax will apply to it. So what we're suggesting is that if you try to live in it first, then it can be a capital gains tax-free asset. Now, how long you need to live in it is not one of the criteria, but there is, if you look on the ATO's website, it does provide some of the criteria, which is that you have lived in it, you've got your furniture in it, you've got utilities in your own name, and the duration that you live in it does factor into it, but it's not the be-all and end-all. We used to say, live in it for 12 months, but it's not necessarily the requirement. You just need to have lived in it and it's been your own home. So there's not a specific time requirement. Another way to purchase property, and a number of you asked about, you were coming online to learn about investing in property. And one of the key things there is if you own your own home already and you're wanting to invest in buy an investment property, the key thing is what structure to utilize. And one of the options is to buy property within your self-managed super fund. You can borrow to invest in superannuation. So you can use your existing balance in super. You would need to set up your own self-managed super fund to do it, but you can invest in property through superannuation. You borrow to invest to do it if you haven't got enough in there already to buy a property outright. But there are strict rules around it. You, your families and your friends can't live in that property. There's a significant setup cost for an SMSF. They are coming down, but there are still significant setup and ongoing costs to run a self-managed super funds. So if you've got a property that is of low value and not much in super, then it's probably not the right thing. But if you've got sufficient money in super to have a fair bit of liquidity there, then it can be an approach to take. The strict superannuation rules, including those rules around not having family and friends live in it, apply. You can buy that property in your self-managed super fund, and then once you've able to access your superannuation, for example turning 65, you can then transfer that property outside of your super and live in it then, but you do need to factor in that there's stamp duty would apply on the transfer, so that can be a bit of a hit at that point in time. But there are other alternatives, like rather than just buying your own home, you could potentially go down the track of doing it through superannuation as well. Alternative to negative gearing is to positively gear, Amberin. So what's the alternative to negative gearing is to positively gear. So rather than you paying out more than what you generate, you might try to get to the point where you've got so much equity in your property, or you're generating so much return on your property that you're not paying out more than you're bringing in. That's positive geared property, and that's a great way to manage things. The challenge in Sydney and Melbourne is that it's without a significant deposit, even beyond 10%, it's hard to positively gear property, and that's where the challenge can be. George asks, so with super, a residential investment property is okay, not just restricted to commercial property? That's right, you can invest in residential property within super. It just means that you can't live in it, friends can't live in it. So that's the restriction with property within self-managed super funds. What you can't do is own an investment property in your own name, or even your own home in your own name, and transfer that into superannuation. The restriction is that you can only transfer a property that you own in your own name or a related party into superannuation if it is a commercial property. That might be the rule that you're thinking of there, George. So there are a few alternatives if you can't afford to buy a home to live in. So think through those, or you just continue to save for that deposit as much as you can, build it up so that you can afford to purchase a home in the future. I get asked by a lot of clients actually, how can we help our children purchase property? And often we have the discussion about, well, you've got a certain amount of wealth, you could retain that and continue to grow it and build it, and enable on your death, or the death of both spouses in the couple, that money can transfer to the kids, and that will benefit them at some point in time on your death. But when we start to dig down a little bit deeper and we say, well, if you're not utilizing all these funds, if you're not needing all these funds for your plans, and you have surplus assets, then it actually is, if you look at your net worth among your broader family group, being, say, for example, adult children and their family, if you're looking at how can I build the wealth of the broader group, it is actually a really effective strategy to help your kids to get into their own home. And the key reason for that is that they're able to grow that asset as a capital gains tax free. If you are either able to help them to get into their own home or pay off their mortgage more quickly, that really helps them build an asset that is a tax-free asset. So it creates if you think about your net wealth as from a broader family perspective, it is a great way to help the broader family. There are a number of ways you can do that. One is through cheap accommodation, so you might allow your kids to live at home. You might not downsize your home and allow the kids to stay at home for cheap accommodation, which I think a number of people I know have ended up downsizing or moving out of home so that the kids would leave home and stand on their own 2 feet. But it is a great way to help them through cheap accommodation. You can go guarantor for your kids. Now this is where rather than, your kids might not have a 20% deposit, but they might have a 10% deposit. And so what brokers and banks sometimes do is say, well, how about you get your parents to provide some security, and it might just be if they need an extra $60,000 or so of security to avoid mortgage insurance, that one-off cost that's got no benefit for you but just protects your lender. If often you can avoid that mortgage insurance by providing your home, for example, as security to enable the kids to avoid that once-off cost. As the value of the property goes up and there's equity grown, or they've paid down the mortgage more quickly, then you can release that guarantee and you no longer have to provide your property as security. Now, it is a way of providing a benefit for your kids, but there are specific verses in the Bibles that says do not go guarantor, and if you are a guarantor for somebody, then get out of it as soon as possible. So I'm not a big fan of it, although it is done quite commonly, and the risks of it are relatively low in the context of our in Australian environment at the moment. So it is something that you can and many people do consider, particularly when the banks raise it as kids are pursuing loans. Another way to assist your kids is to loan money to your kids. Now this has got some benefits because you can loan them the money to help them get into the property market. They can avoid that mortgage insurance. But there are some negatives to it, and the negatives again relate to biblical financial principles, including the one that often is easiest to explain is the Proverbs 22:7, where it says, "Just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender." And so when we're lending money to our kids, then we're creating that borrower and servant relationship. And so that can cause, and I've met with numerous both parents and children who have loaned money between themselves, between the family members, and it has caused friction. And I think it's because that principle that the borrower is servant to the lender, and often parents provide the loan, and you create that relationship that is an ongoing relationship of until the money is either paid back or the loan forgiven. And so it does cause friction sometimes. And if, for example, you've loaned money and then you see your kids not being wise, as you would see good management of finances, then it can cause some friction. They might be doing holidays and they're not paying you back as much as they could be if they weren't doing the holidays, and that can cause some level of friction. There's one commentator that says that Christmas dinner tastes differently when you owe money to your folks, and it's that principle of the relationship of loaning money. It does sometimes work, but there are complexities around it. The other one is to invest with your kids, and this can work as well. So you're not loaning money to your kids, you're just investing with them. And so this might be that you're buying into a property, and you might own 50% and they own 50%. And it is a valid way to assist them, because they might have a 10% deposit. You might have a equity in your home that can provide the security to purchase the property. Now, the challenges with this scenario is that you might have different objectives. One is wanting to generate income for retirement. The other one is wanting somewhere to live in, or to rent out for a time as an investment. But they might at some point in time want to then buy a home to live in. So the challenge there is trying to think through all the different scenarios that might come up that could cause problems. So if one party wants to sell and the other one doesn't, what do you do there? If if there are problems with the property, and there's repairs that need to be done, who's going to chip in there? Or if your child is living it in the property as their primary place of residence where they live, how do you get remunerated for your 50% ownership? So you need to think through all those issues. And then if at some point in time the child wants to buy out your ownership portion, then you need to factor in that the stamp duty would apply as well. So you need to factor in those kind of issues. So it is possible, it is a mechanism that you can use to help your kids, but it does present some challenges as well, and you need to try and think through all the possible scenarios that could occur there. You could invest for your kids. Now, a couple of clients have done this in that they're thinking through that our kids aren't ready. We're not ready to gift money to our kids. They're not ready to buy properties, but we'd like to think about providing for them longer term, being as property is difficult to get into. And so in these scenarios, we've got parents who might have, say, 2 kids, and they've bought 2 investment properties, and they've kind of got them flagged for the kids at some point in time. So the idea is that they'll pay them down over time, they'll be fully paid off at some point in time, and then one day they will pass those on to the kids. That might be in the event of their death, and they'll receive that through the will, or it might be that they transfer it prior to death. And so there's a number of different ways of doing it, but the thing that you need to factor in there is that it's basically the parent's investment property for the time being, and you need to factor in the tax and the cash flow arrangements because they are basically investments in your own name. And then if you did at some point in time transfer them to the kids, you need to think about capital gains tax and stamp duty at the time that you do transfer them through to the kids. John just says, you might think you can trust your kids, but you can't necessarily trust who they marry. Good point, John. So in that case, when maybe I'll touch on the next segment, I'll come back to the loaning money to kids. So that's investing for your kids. So not giving them the money now, but sort of planning for them for the longer term and investing in your own name. The final option, and then there might be others in here, but these are the key options that I come across, is gifting money to your kids. And I find this to be the most freeing for kids. And it also is the least challenging from a relationship perspective as well. It's got the least likely to cause problems relationally. And this involves just effectively gifting the funds to your kids, no strings attached, and they can then go and choose to invest that. And ideally, you'd be putting some, giving it to them as they're about to purchase a property, but it might not necessarily be that. As long as you've passed on the wisdom of utilizing the finances well and ensuring that they can handle the money well, passing on wisdom before wealth is key. And then gifting is an appropriate way to assist your kids. Now, you can do it in a number of ways. You might say, well, if we'll match whatever you save, or we might double whatever you save towards a deposit. So if they've saved 40 grand, you might say, well, I'll chip in 80 grand. Or if you save 10 grand, I'll chip in 10 grand, or whatever the rules might be. But it's good to encourage them to towards positive behaviours. And so even if a child, for example, owns their property but has a mortgage, you can match their extra mortgage repayments just to encourage them to pay off their mortgage more quickly. Lots of different ways you can assist your kids, but the benefit of gifting the money is that there's no strings attached. So versus loaning the money to the kids, there's no strings attached, and there's not then therefore the relationship issues. Now, you might still have problems with them going and spending money in a way that you're not comfortable with or you don't think is wise, but you just got to remind yourself that, oh no, I gave this money and it's no strings attached, and it is you just need to remind yourself of that. And so that can be the healthiest way to do it. But as John raised, there sometimes are issues around the fact that you might trust your kids, but you don't trust, or you don't feel as though either the spouse that they've chosen is a good choice, or you've got concerns about the longevity of the marriage. Sometimes what you can do in that scenario is you can loan the money to the kids rather than gifting it to the kids, and what you can do there is you've effectively setting up a loan agreement where at any point in time, so you basically, you give the kids the money, you set up a loan agreement, and it's a legal document that I would suggest doing through a lawyer. And then if something happened to the marriage and it dissolved and they had to sell the home, you would have that as a loan against the property that would need to be paid back, and it would come back to you rather than being divided by the two spouses. So it is a way to structure things, even though it's not necessarily, as I see, the most desirable way to do it. But if there are concerns, it is a potential way to structure helping the kids. So there's a number of ways parents can help. Now, depending on whether you are eligible for Centrelink benefits, so social security benefits, there may be some implications if you are gifting money, because it's basically reducing your assets, and therefore Centrelink need to manage that, and they have rules around it, because you could just give away all of your assets and then go on the full age pension, and so they're trying to prevent people doing that. So there are rules around gifting. So if you are either going to be on Centrelink in 5 years' time, or eligible for Centrelink benefits in 5 years' time, so that might be the age pension is generally what we're talking about, then gifting within the 5-year period of being eligible for the age pension can impact how much pension you get longer term. So I'll just try and explain that to you. So gifting or deprivation of assets or income is when you destroy or dispose or diminish of assets or income, and you don't receive adequate adequate financial compensation or consideration for it. So it could be that you've gifted a car to your children. The value of that car would be considered a gift. It might involve that you might be receiving an inheritance from your parents, and you choose not to take that and pass it on to your kids, that's another way where gifting is factored in. You can get around that by getting your parents to change their will to go directly to your kids, and then you've never received the money. But how it works is that if you have gifted money or assets to anybody really, but to the kids is what we're thinking about here, then the limits are that you can give $10,000 per year, per financial year, and this is per couple or per individual. If you're a couple, it's the same limit as if you're a single person. You can gift $10,000 per year or $30,000 over a rolling 5-year period. If you go over those amounts, the excess is considered an asset for 5 years. So it's still considered an asset for 5 years from Centrelink's perspective, and any entitlements that you might be eligible for may be reduced based on that amount still being considered an asset. After the 5 years period, after the 5-year period has expired, then it ceases to be an asset at that point in time. If you're not on Centrelink benefits, you're not likely to be on Centrelink benefits for 5 years, then you don't have to worry about these rules, and you can go for your life gifting assets. But it is well worth considering because many people are eligible for a part pension, and it can actually impact their situation. Just got a few more questions coming through. John just asks, are there any government restrictions on how much or how often you can gift to your children? So the only restriction, so you can gift as much as you like to your children. There's no problem there. The government doesn't restrict that at all. It just impacts you if you are eligible for some social security benefits. So the age pension is the classic one that it can cause some problems, as I've just described. I'm not going to go into it here because we're just running short of time, but I'll include a link to the last year's webinar where I walk through a few more slides on this deprivation of assets and some of the examples of how it's calculated. The other thing to mention is a new piece of legislation that was announced in May budget last year that has now been legislated. It wasn't legislated when I did the last webinar on this topic. It is not a direct link, but you could actually use this concept to help your kids as well. So there's this what we call Downsizer super contribution scheme, and the principle is that if you sell your home after the 1st of July 2018 and you're over 65 years of age, then you can put up to $300,000 into your superannuation. And for a couple, that might be $600,000 into your superannuation. So the key thing is you need to contract to sell your home after the 30th of June 2018. You need to be over 65, and then you can get money into super. Now you might be saying, well, we're talking about helping kids buy their first home. Why are you thinking about selling your home, buying a smaller home or home of less value and then putting the money into super? You could choose to gift that money to your kids as well, or you could choose to invest in a property within super. So it's just another concept, another idea, and potentially how you could help your kids, or even just boost your own funds available for your retirement. So it enables you to put up to $300,000 or $600,000 as a couple into super. And the key thing here is that there's no work test. Normally when you're over 65, you need to satisfy a work test of working 40 hours in 30 days to get money into super. There's also a $1.6 million rule, so if you've already got that much in your super, then you can't get any more into super unless you utilize this downsizer rule. And the $100,000 annual limit doesn't apply either. So it just frees up you to put money into super if you sell your home. The property must be an Australian property. It must be owned for at least 10 years, and you must have lived in it at some point. An investment property that neither of you lived on is not eligible for this particular strategy. Just a quick example. So the downsizer contribution scheme, Tom is 78 and Hazel's 75. So if they're not working, they are not allowed to put money into their super. So they've got $50,000 in their super, they've got a $700,000 property and it's too big for them, and they've got $20,000 in the bank. They're receiving the full age pension. Now, they might want to reduce the size of their home because there's too much gardening to do, there's too many rooms to maintain, etc. And so they might want to sell their $700,000 property and buy a $500,000 property. Now, just need to note that when you're doing this, going through this transaction, you just need to make sure that there's no age Centrelink or age pension impact, because when your home, the home that you live in, is not an asset that's tested for Centrelink purposes. So when you sell a home for $700 and buy another one for $500, you've increased your asset test for Centrelink purposes by $200,000. Now, in this scenario, it's not going to impact them because they're under the lower threshold, and so it won't impact it won't reduce their pension at all. But if that means that it pushes you below the lower thresholds, or it might even push you off the age pension altogether, you need to really factor that into this particular scenario. So here's two different scenarios. So for Hazel, before the 1st of July, if they downsize, they've changed their home from $700,000 to $500,000 home, bought a smaller home, they've just got the money in the bank, so $220,000 in the bank, and they've got $50,000 in super. And so they're not able to get into that tax-free superannuation phase because they're not eligible for it. But if they sold their home after the 1st of July 2018, then they're able to put that extra funds, and we've said $200,000 that they netted from their home, into their super. And the benefit of that is that they can take advantage of the tax-free pension phase of superannuation. They wouldn't actually pay a lot of tax here over in their bank account, but it means that they can have the simple structure of investing in other assets other than cash through their superannuation. So that's an example how the downsizer contribution scheme works. It probably has a bigger effect for those people who are not on the age pension because they have too much income or assets, because that means they are able to get it into the tax-free pension phase and continue to not pay any tax on the excess, or it might mean that they can gift that money to their kids or loan that money to the kids to get into property. So yeah, that's just the rules around the downsizer super contribution scheme. And I think we're getting close to the hour, so I'll just cover off a few of your questions. Amberin asks, slide note, are the rules the same with disability pension? The disability pension is slightly different to the age pension in that if you have assets in excess of the lower threshold, you can come off the disability support pension altogether. So there are slightly tighter rules with the disability support pension than the age pension. So you need to be a bit more careful in that respect. Gordon asks, can a property owned in New Zealand be used as equity or in some way to help purchase a property in Australia? I would suggest a yes. You would just need to have a lender that was prepared to do that. So maybe a lender that's across the New Zealand market as well, like the ANZ, for example, might be appropriate. I would suggest that would be the case, that you could utilise that as equity, the New Zealand property. So keep your questions coming through. I've just finished up the content that I have. If you need more information, then I'll be emailing you these slides and recording of this webinar. I'll also you can also contact us via our website, so cornerstonewealth.com.au. You might like to email us at info@cornerstonewealth.com.au. And the phone number is 1300 275 428. Christian Super is available as well, so christiansuper.com.au. The email address is members@christiansuper.com.au, and the phone number is 1300 360 907. I do have a range of other questions that I'll go through now that you asked on registration. So Laura asks, raising deposit. So the key thing to raising a deposit is to just save cash flow. So really two ways of doing that: increasing your income or reducing your expenses, or a combination of both. Where you put that money is another thing. So some of the higher yielding term deposits are a good place to put funds in the short term. I know the likes of your ING, as long as you satisfy all their hoops of putting $1,000 into your account and then I think spending a particular amount on the associated card gives you access to higher interest. So just those high yielding term deposits is a great place to put it. First Home Savers Super Scheme is another great way to boost your income, as we mentioned earlier. Just going back to Gordon, just says, thanks very much for your time and wisdom, Gavin. Really appreciate this material and your perspective. God bless you, Sarah and Gordon. Thanks for the positive feedback, guys. Appreciate your questions and interaction. Have a good night and God bless. Kelly asks, why does my investment property provide little or no benefit at tax time? It's probably because it's positively geared. So you're generating more income from it than you're paying out, which is actually a positive thing. If you're actually paying tax on your investment property, it generally means that you're generating a profit, and that's better than getting a tax deduction and making a loss. You may want to factor in whether there's any further depreciation you can claim on that property, but it's not always a bad thing paying tax. It means that you're making a profit. Ingrid asks, buying an investment property. If you're looking at buying an investment property, the key thing is to think about the structure in which you're going to buy it in and making sure that you've got sufficient cash flow. Some people leverage up too much and end up being really tight, and therefore it impacts their level of generosity. And there is a balance there. It is good to grow your assets so that you can build your wealth and then support yourself and utilize it in the future. But if it then means that you have to pull back on your generosity now, then you need to balance those two competing interests up. John asks, when to divest rental properties in the light of retiring? Really good question, John. There's a key to that is often it's about eligibility to contribute to super and your level of taxable income and whether you want to divest of the properties at all. Often we focus on getting as much as possible into the super environment prior to not being able to get it in anymore. And you need to deal with contribution limits. So $100,000 a year of non-concessional contributions and $25,000 of concessional contributions, and then up to the age of 65, then you've got to satisfy a work test. So it's really about managing getting the money into the super environment if they're not already, and then also managing the tax around it as well. If you're on a high income and triggering capital gains, it's not ideal either. So, John, it's about timing of those things. Karen asks, how much is needed for a deposit these days? You can have low deposits of 5 and 10%. The regulator is putting more pressure on lenders to assume a higher rate of interest with the interest rate cycle in an upward swing. So with interest rates in the US increasing and the regulator wanting to put a little bit of a hold on property prices accelerating so much, they've required lenders to assume like a 7.5% interest rate to see whether you can afford the loan, rather than like a 4% interest rate that you might actually get at the moment, based on the fact that interest rates are likely to rise, and they're trying to also pull back the heat in the property market, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. So how much is needed? Ideally a 20% deposit, but some lenders, particularly if you're prepared to pay for a mortgage insurance, will allow you to have less than that. Dan asks, the strategy to renovate, buy to renovate, then sell or lease. What structure to use in this method? Buying in personal name, in a trust or a company? Yeah, often the simplest method is in a personal name. If you've got a lower income spouse and there's going to be a big capital gain, then often the lower income spouse is a good mechanism for purchasing it in. If you want to, if you know, or the plan is that they make significant profit and you want to give of the profits tax effectively, family trusts are still a really good mechanism. Companies are often not as good because there's no discount on the capital gain. So within your personal name, you can discount gains by 50%, or in a trust, you can do that also, but in a company, you don't get that 50% discount on gains. So I'd say generally personal name or trust. Superannuation is probably not the best mechanism or best structure to buy a property if you're going to renovate it. There's a bit too much complexity there to do that. You can do it, but there's just a lot of hoops to jump through. Lillian asks how to generate more wealth through investment properties. Well, that's just a matter of affordability and from a cash flow perspective, and then getting out there and purchasing them, making sure you got the structure right, as in individual names, trust or super, there's property in there's property. Some people don't always make money from property, and you've really got to know your stuff, I guess. Do your research, know the types of property to get in, and often people just create a particular niche that they know, a particular either area or type of property. I've got a colleague who's his particular niche is purchasing into regional area motels. So he just knows how they work, he knows how to operate them, and he purchases them often at discount rates and buys that single particular asset class because he knows it and he understands it and he can make it work, and he's generated a good long-term wealth strategy by just knowing that particular niche. So I guess that's the thing I'd encourage you to do, to create a niche that you understand and know the value of and understand how it works. It's probably the key. Joanne asks, qualifying for a home loan. A best thing there is to go and speak to either a mortgage broker or your bank directly. And just say, ask, I'm wanting to purchase a home. How do I go about qualifying for a home? Obviously, the best way to do it is to have a large deposit, show that you've built that up through your savings. Often there is a question mark around, should I be creating a credit score by having a credit card? I'm not a massive fan of that. It is really essential in the US to create your credit score. Otherwise, the lenders don't often enable you to borrow. But qualifying for a home loan, the key thing there is to speak to your mortgage broker and get their input on it. Heather says, thanks for your time. It was much appreciated and informative, as there was some things about super I didn't know. Thank you. Pleasure, Heather. If you've got other questions about super, then a couple of other webinars, we'll be doing revisions on them later in the year, but if you go to cornerstonewealth.com.au/retire 2017, that's got some good retirement planning type super issues if that's your need. Otherwise, I think we're doing some other topics later in the year as well. Dan says, thank you and God bless. Pleasure, Dan. Thanks for joining us. Keep your questions coming through and I'll answer them. Otherwise, I'll cover off these questions that you asked on registration for the webinar. Sylvia says, how to best set ourselves up for retirement. As I just mentioned to Heather, I'm not sure, Heather, whether you're at the retirement stage or not, but just in case you were. The best thing is to go to cornerstonewealth.com.au/retire 2017. It's got the retirement planning webinar series. And then after that, if you're interested in Centrelink issues, you go to cornerstonewealth.com.au/Centrelink 2017. And that'll give you the Centrelink series of webinars that can be useful if you think you might be eligible or don't understand how that works. It explains all that. Then we've got Manuela. How can we recognize the best time to buy or when to notice it? How can I find investment properties with positive cash flow? Really good questions there. The best time to buy is when there's blood in the street, is what they say, and it's when we emotionally don't feel like purchasing whether that be shares or property. So we've seen in, I guess, the Sydney market, the properties come off a little bit in most recently. But if you look around other areas other than Sydney and Melbourne, there's been a tapering in valuations throughout other areas in Australia. So to some degree, you might suggest that it's a good time to get into the market. But I think the key time will be once we see interest rate rises from the Reserve Bank of Australia. And it might not be the first interest rate rise, but it might be the second or third interest rate rise. And we don't know when that will be. A lot of economists are saying that it's not actually going to be this year, or it's going to be later this year and then into 2019. But assuming that our economy is able to keep chugging along and in unemployment it keeps reducing, then there is likely to be a time that we're going to see a rise in interest rates. And I think that will have the biggest hit on property prices, particularly if we get several interest rate rises. We're likely to see an upward swing in interest rates regardless of the RBA because of the cost of borrowing of our institutions in Australia, the cost of them borrowing overseas with interest rates in the US increasing. It's likely to increase interest rates for customers here in Australia, even if the Reserve Bank doesn't increase the target cash rate. But if it does, I think that's going to be a good time to potentially purchase some properties. But it's very difficult to get the bottom of markets. It's very difficult to pick the tops of markets. So I guess you need to balance that with your own affordability, your own sense of value in the market, and knowing that if you invest longer term, you're likely to, over the long term, see the value of your asset increase. Karen asks, am I able to invest in property on a single income of $65,000 before taxes? Yeah, really good question. I would just touch base with a mortgage broker and see what they say, and they might be able to assist you with some ideas of how you might be able to get into the market. You could definitely get into so if you're renting, for example, at the moment, and you are able to buy a property because you're either in a regional area or you're able to buy a property of where the mortgage repayments are equivalent to your rent, then yes, it would suggest that you are able to buy a property. But I would touch base with your bank or mortgage broker and see what they say in terms of your capacity to borrow. Michael asks, how to help my kids get into the property market as soon as possible. I think we'll talk through those throughout the webinar. And asks, making good decisions in my last years of work, super and retirement. Next question, I get updates via Christian Super. Yeah, maybe, and that same website, so cornerstonewealth.com.au/retire 2017 might be useful for you there. Danilo asks, where is the best location in Sydney if I have a budget of $500,000 to $600,000? I don't really know, Danilo. It's not my specialty in terms of property locations. There are buyers advocates available in throughout Australia who can help you purchase properties, but often they're going to charge 2% of the price of the property. But it can be a reasonable investment if they're able to get you a cheaper property, pay 2% less and buy a good property that's going to provide a good return as well. But buyers advocates can provide a good service as well. Danny asks, in a rut, need to see the profit margin increase. I guess that's about being disciplined, creating a budget, or at least a reverse budget where you put money into your employment income goes into a single account. You're setting aside giving and any taxes that you need to allocate, and then your savings, and then you're spending the rest. So a forced saving mechanism is really good. Moving to debit cards rather than credit cards can help that process. Matt asks, how to ensure you can make a make repayments without stopping being generous to others. The key there is making sure that you don't overcommit, Matt, and the key details there were, and we were talking about our own home and not going over 40% of your take-home income going towards your housing costs, so that's your rates and your mortgage or rent. That's a good mechanism to think about in terms of your own housing costs. But if you're thinking about going and purchasing an investment property, you just need to do a little bit more detailed cash flow management and making sure that you're not overcommitting yourself there, and therefore meaning that you're not being able to be generous. But really, I love your heart there, Matt, and what you're wanting to achieve. Yeah, good on you. Mary asks, helping kids get home and reconsidering debt. Reconsolidating debt, sorry. Helping kids get a home, buy a home, and reconsolidating debt. Yeah, hopefully we've covered off the helping kids get home and get a home and those sort of options, Mary. And then reconsolidating debt. Yeah, it is sometimes good to consolidate your debt. It's a little bit of a concern that you're saying reconsolidate debt. Sounds like you've reconsolidated it before and then gone out and used credit cards again, and then you're having to reconsolidate debt again into that debt, into the mortgage loan. That's not a good sign or a good signal. I would suggest, if that's the case, and we're going on very little information here, Mary, but if you are going through that process, I would say cut up your credit cards, pay them off more quickly, focus on them. Don't consolidate them into your home loan. Yeah, focus on paying them off and then start paying down the home loan more quickly. The cycle of utilizing credit cards and then putting it onto the home mortgage because you've equity in your home's gone up and your bank will let you borrow more is not a good cycle. So I'd encourage you to seek some help there if that's your scenario. Timothy asks, where is the best locations for investing in property and what are some of the key points to consider when doing so? Good question. Not quite my specialty, so I'd suggest you focus on other sources of that, whether it's buyers, advocates, whether it's other experts in the property industry. I've got some views on it, like in the capital cities, buying at least a 2-bedroom property, having a car park. Closer to the city is better. Those sort of principles, but best to seek a bit more detailed advice around that. And they're only just generalizations there. Noel asks, as immigrants, how can we invest for retirement? The key thing there is, if you can, save towards purchasing your own home and then building up your retirement assets, paying down the debt on your home. Retirement assets, I'm generally talking about superannuation, but it could be other assets as well. Julie asks, how can I get into the market when I'm paying rent and therefore can't save as much? Yeah, good question, Julie. It's a challenge. Sometimes you can think creatively. You can, if you're a single person, for example, you might be able to do house sitting and where you don't pay rent. There are a range of other things that you could potentially do. I'm not sure whether it's share housing, other things that you can try to do to either reduce your expenses or increase your income to help save towards that deposit. If you are able to have others stay in the home that you do buy, then it can mean that you can get into your home more quickly. It's a challenge, but you can still achieve those goals. Other things people have done have, purchased a caravan and lived in, asked to park it in the backyard of somebody's house and lived in the van for a while. It's not the most desirable, but if your family's small enough or you're a single person, then those sorts of things can save you significantly. You can plow money towards your deposit to put towards a home. So just think creatively and see what might come of it. I just got a question popping up. John says, thanks, that was helpful. Pleasure, John. Thanks for joining us again. Hope you and Liz are both well. I think I'm up to James, which is how to get into the property market with the smallest down payment and modest income below 65k. I think that was very much similar to a previous question, so I'll skip that one. Lynn asks how to make the best use of my superannuation when I don't have a bundle and I'm using Centrelink New Start payments to live on. Yeah, that's really challenging, Liz. If you're on New Start, I guess it's really just about ensuring that you've only got the insurances or paying for the insurances in your account that you need, and so reducing any fees going out of your superannuation account. Making sure that you're in the right investment option, that's relevant to you. Yeah, hard to know without any further information on your particular scenario there, Lynn. And then Leanne just asking about retirement. Go to cornerstonewealth.com.au/retire 2017 or give us a call. Thanks very much for joining us. I think there's only a few of you online at the moment, but thank you to those that did stay online. Appreciate you joining us. And if you do have further information or further questions, just make contact with us. Thanks again. Good night and God bless.